There is a white granite headstone in Arlington National Cemetery. Section 60, the name carved into it reads Larry Allen Thorne. It sounds American, it is not. The man buried beneath it was born in Finland, fought for 3 separate armies across 3 separate decades, held the highest military honour his birth country could bestow, and died on a classified mission into a country the United States was not officially operating in. He was the only man in recorded history to serve as a combat officer in the Finnish army, the Waffen-SS, and the United States Special Forces. He was the only former member of the Waffen-SS ever buried at Arlington. When his remains were finally identified in 2003, nearly 4 decades after his helicopter vanished into a Laotian mountain, the soldiers who had served with him in the Green Berets had never stopped toasting his health every year. They did not believe he was dead. They believed that if any man alive could survive a helicopter crash in enemy jungle and walk out the other side, it was him. His name was Lauri Törni, and this is the full account of what he did. Törni was born on 28th of May 1919 in the city of Viipuri, in the Finnish province of Karelia. The city sat 32 kilometers from what would later become Soviet Leningrad, close enough that on a clear day the industrial haze from across the border was visible on the horizon. Finland itself was barely 2 years old as an independent nation, having broken from the Russian Empire in 1917 during the chaos of the Bolshevik Revolution. The country Törni was born into was raw, fractured, and surrounded. It had fought a vicious civil war in 1918 between the pro-independence White Guards and Soviet-backed Red Guards, and Törni's own father, a ship captain named Jalmari, had fought on the white side. That fact mattered. It shaped the family's politics, their view of Russia, and by extension the man Lauri Törni would become. Anti-communism was not ideology in that household. It was lived experience transmitted through blood. Karelia was not simply a region, it was a borderland, a zone of contest between Finnish and Russian civilizations across centuries, a place where the forests ran deep and the winters were savage and the people understood in their bones what it meant to share a border with a neighbour that wanted your land. Törni grew up hunting and skiing in those forests. He joined the Civil Guard, Finland's volunteer paramilitary militia, as a teenager, before his parents pressured him to attend business school. He went, he was not interested. He graduated and signed up for military service in September 1938 at the age of 19, assigned to the 4th Independent Jaeger Infantry Battalion, stationed at Kiviniemi on the Karelian Isthmus. The Jaeger were not standard infantry. They were light, fast, mobile troops, trained for ambush, skirmishing, and rapid movement through broken terrain. Törni graduated first in his NCO class. His commanders noted he was not simply capable. He was driven by something that standard military motivation could not fully account for, a fierce, almost predatory investment in combat itself. On November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. It did so with roughly 450,000 troops along a front that stretched the full length of the Finnish-Soviet border, from the Karelian Isthmus in the south to the Arctic tundra in the north. The Soviets had expected a swift, overwhelming victory. The Finnish army numbered fewer than 300,000 men. Soviet armour and artillery were vastly superior in weight and number. Stalin had assumed Finland would collapse within weeks. He was, by any measure, catastrophically wrong. The Finns knew this terrain better than any army on Earth. They had no significant air power and no heavy armour to speak of, but they could move through winter forest on skis in temperatures that sank to minus 40 degrees Celsius. The Red Army, with hundreds of thousands of men from Central Asia and Ukraine, who had never seen snow like this, froze at night, got lost in forests with no roads, and died in enormous numbers trying to advance through ground that the Finns used like a weapon. Törni's 4th Jaeger Battalion was deployed to the Rautu sector on the Karelian Isthmus, today the Russian town of Sosnovo, directly in the path of the Soviet 7th Army's advance. His unit's function in the opening weeks was to delay the Red Army's progress, absorb contact, bleed the enemy, and pull back in good order to successive defensive lines while buying time for the main Finnish force to concentrate. The fighting in that sector was close, violent, and conducted in near-total darkness. Soviet columns would advance along the few available roads, packed into a formation that presented a dense, slow-moving target. The Jaeger did not engage them head-on. They hit the column from the flanks, from behind, from the trees alongside the road. Submachine gun bursts, satchel charges rolled into the column's centre, then withdrawal before the Soviets could fix Finnish positions for artillery. The effect was multiplied by darkness and by cold. that seized exposed men within minutes of standing still. Törni led his section in these engagements and remained composed in a way that made him identifiable within his unit. Where other men tightened under fire or hesitated, he grew quieter and more precise. He rose to undersergeant and led his squad overrunning Soviet positions at close range, dragging prisoners back through the forest to extract intelligence his commanders needed. The Lake Ladoga sector to the north of the Karelian Isthmus produced some of the Winter War's most decisive Finnish successes, and it was here that Törni's reputation first began to form at a command level. The terrain around Ladoga was classic Finnish killing ground. Dense birch and pine forest, frozen lake surfaces, and the single narrow roads that Soviet mechanized columns were entirely dependent on. Finnish commanders under General Harold Öqvist exploited this dependency methodically. The Soviet 18th Division and elements of the 168th Division pushed into the Lemeti area south of Lake Ladoga in late December 1939 and were encircled by the Finns in a series of operations that severed the Soviet road axes and transformed the trapped formations into mottis, isolated pockets of men surrounded and cut off from resupply. Törni's battalion participated directly in the destruction of these encircled formations at Lemeti. The fighting was brutal and conducted in conditions that defied conventional military logic. Soviet soldiers froze to death in their vehicles with the engines still running. Horses starved where they stood. Entire divisional formations simply ceased to exist as coherent fighting units inside those frozen pockets. The Finns moved through the tree line at night, closed on the perimeter of each motti, and systematically destroyed it from the outside in. It was not clean work. It was effective. The Winter War lasted 105 days. In those 105 days, the Soviet Union suffered an estimated 320,000 to 380,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing and captured, against a Finnish army that never exceeded 300,000 men. The humiliation was severe enough that when Adolf Hitler and his staff were planning Operation Barbarossa 18 months later, one of their foundational assumptions was that the Red Army, having been mauled so badly by Finland, was fundamentally incompetent. That assumption was wrong in ways that would eventually destroy Germany, but the Winter War created it. Finland was the reason the Wehrmacht drove east in June 1941 with such confidence. The specific fighting quality that produced this outcome, the mobile, decentralized, terrain-exploiting style of war that allowed small Finnish units to destroy formations 3 and 4 times their size, was the school Törni had been trained in and would spend the rest of his military life teaching to others. The Moscow Peace Treaty was signed on March 12, 1940. Finland had not won. It had survived, which was not the same thing. The peace terms required Finland to cede approximately 11% of its territory, including virtually all of Karelia, including Viipuri, Törni's hometown. Around 400,000 Karelians were evacuated from their homes and relocated to what remained of Finland. The Törni family was among them. The loss was total, not just territory on a map, but the specific landscape of his childhood, the city where he was born, the physical geography of his identity. He was 20 years old, and his home no longer existed within the borders of his country. For a man of Törni's constitution, this was not an abstraction, it was a wound, and it produced a specific, lasting, concrete commitment to doing whatever was necessary to fight the power that had inflicted it. By the end of the Winter War, Törni's performance had been noticed at every level of his chain of command. He demonstrated the rarer quality of tactical coherence under pressure, the ability to read a deteriorating situation and make decisions that slowed the deterioration rather than accelerating it. He was assigned to officer training and commissioned as a Venrikki, a second lieutenant in the reserves, in May 1940. He was 20 years old and had been in combat for fewer than 4 months. The peace that ended the Winter War was universally understood inside Finland as a temporary arrangement. Stalin had not gotten what he wanted. The question was not whether he would try again. The question was when. In June 1941, Törni travelled secretly to Vienna, Austria, for 7 weeks of intensive training with the Waffen-SS. The decision requires context that is too often flattened into ideology when the reality was strategic. Germany, in 1941, was the only power in Europe with both the capability and the motivation to counterbalance Soviet pressure on Finland. The Waffen-SS training program at the Vienna Schönbrunn facility was focused specifically on the disciplines most relevant to a Finnish officer operating in the conditions he faced: mountaineering, cold weather movement, survival, and the leadership of small autonomous units in environments where higher command could not intervene. Törni completed the course and returned to Finland in July 1941, holding dual recognition, a Finnish officer's commission and the Waffen-SS rank of Untersturmführer, the equivalent of second lieutenant. He was one of approximately 1,200 Finnish men who made this journey that spring and summer. Those 1,200 Finns were split on arrival in Germany. Around 430 Winter War veterans were distributed directly across the 5th SS Panzer, Division Wiking, as individual replacements. The remaining 800 underwent full training at Vienna Schönbrunn, then Stralsund, then the infantry barracks at Grossborn in Pomerania, before being formally constituted as the Finnisches Freiwilligenbataillon der Waffen-SS, the Finnish Volunteer Battalion of the Waffen-SS, in September 1941. The battalion was attached as the 3rd Battalion of SS Infantry Regiment Nordland under Wiking's command, led by SS Gruppenführer Felix Steiner. Törni was not among them. He had returned to Finland in July and was already operating in the Continuation War as a Finnish army officer, but understanding what the Finnish Volunteer Battalion did on the Eastern Front matters, because it was the formation in whose ranks Törni had trained, and its record illuminates the world he had moved through. The Finnish battalion reached the Mias River in Ukraine on the 8th of January 1942 and received its first combat assignment attached to the Westland Regiment on the 22nd of January. Viking at that point was a gutted formation. It had advanced through Galicia, fought for bridgeheads across the Dnieper, battered its way through the fighting for Rostov-on-Don, and then been driven back to the Mias River as the Soviet winter counter-offensive of 1941-42 collapsed the German front across its entire length. Soviet propaganda in December 1941 had claimed Wiking had been destroyed. It had not been destroyed, but it had bled severely. The defensive battles north of Rostov were so fierce that the motorized division which entered the Soviet Union in June 1941 was functionally an infantry unit by the time the Finnish battalion arrived to reinforce it. The Finns settled into that frozen line in Ukraine and held it through the winter. They knew cold, they knew how to survive in it. It gave them an environmental advantage over both the Germans beside them and the Soviets across the wire. In June 1942, Case Blue began. The German summer offensive drove south toward the Caucasus and the oil that powered the Soviet war machine. Wiking, as part of Army Group A, participated in the recapture of Rostov-on-Don by July 24th, and then swept south and east through the open steppe toward the Caucasus Mountains. The advance covered hundreds of kilometers in weeks. By mid-August, the Finnish battalion had been transported 700 kilometers east of the Mios to the Maykop oil fields and was pushing further east toward Grozny. On August 14th, in the foothills of the Caucasus south of Maykop, the Finnish battalion scattered the remnants of a Red Army cavalry division during the capture of Linehuaja, a brief, sharp action against a force that found itself on the wrong end of an SS infantry battalion in open terrain. It was the kind of engagement the Finns had been built for. By late September 1942, the division had reached the Terek River and was preparing to strike at Grozny itself. The fighting at Malgobek in September and October 1942 was the worst that Wiking endured in the entire war. The Soviets had fortified every ridgeline, every river crossing, every village on the axis of advance, with a thoroughness that reflected the strategic value of what lay behind them. The Grozny oil fields, the Georgian military highway, the route to the Caspian. German and Finnish casualties were appalling. Wiking lost over 1,500 men in the Malgobek-Sagopshin fighting. Combat units that had entered the battle at company strength were reduced to platoons and sections. A Viking veteran wrote afterward that casualties were no longer being counted, only the men still left alive. On October 15th, the Finnish battalion launched an assault against reference point 701 in the Sagopshin-Malgobek area. They carried it on the 16th of October 1942 and held it for 4 consecutive days against Soviet counterattacks that came in repeatedly with armour support and broke each time against the Finnish position. That reference point was the furthest advance of any German Allied formation in the entire Caucasus campaign. The Finnish battalion stood at the absolute high water mark of Germany's push toward Baku, in a killing ground in Chechnya, 5,000 kilometers from Helsinki. Malgobek fell to Wiking on the 6th of October, but the road to Grozny was closed. The oil was unreachable. Stalingrad happened. Wiking began in training westward on December 24th, 1942. When the Finnish battalion returned to Finland in June 1943, it had suffered 256 killed in action, 686 wounded, and 14 missing. For a unit that never exceeded 500 to 800 effective soldiers at any one time, those numbers tell their own story. It must be stated plainly. The march of SS Division, Wiking through Ukraine and into the Caucasus, from 1941 to 1943 passed directly through some of the worst killing fields of the Holocaust. Finnish State Archives research completed in 2019 confirmed that Finnish SS volunteers were present in formations that committed atrocities during this campaign: the murder of Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, and civilians. The Finnish battalion arrived at the front in January 1942 after the initial killing operations through Ukraine, and the documented evidence of Finnish direct participation in atrocities is limited to a specific incident in December 1942 in the village of Tolzgun in the Caucasus. The broader record of the Finnish battalion's specific involvement as opposed to the wider Wiking Division's conduct remains a subject of ongoing historical scrutiny. This is part of the record, and it belongs in any honest account. Törni himself was not on that front. He had returned to Finland in July 1941 and was fighting the Continuation War as a Finnish army officer, but he had trained in that formation with those men under that command structure. The world the Finnish volunteer battalion inhabited was the world his Vienna training had introduced him to. That context does not resolve into a simple verdict. It is what it is. The Continuation War began on June 25, 1941, 3 days after Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. Finland did not declare itself a member of the Axis. Manorheim and the Finnish government were careful to frame the conflict as a separate, parallel war, the recovery of territory lost in 1940, and the defence of Finnish sovereignty. The distinction mattered politically. The practical reality was that Finland and Germany were fighting the same enemy, on the same front, at the same time. Törni threw himself into it. In the early phase, before Detachment Thorne existed as a formal entity, he was given command of a Finnish armoured unit equipped with captured Soviet tanks and armoured cars, machines taken from the enemy and turned against him. It was characteristically Törni. You use what works, regardless of where it came from. On March 23, 1942, Törni was operating behind Soviet lines on a prisoner capture mission, moving on skis through forest, when he crossed a friendly mine. The explosion threw him badly. He was severely wounded and evacuated to a military hospital. He did not stay. Against direct medical orders, still in the process of healing, he went AWOL and returned to the front. The men who served with him considered this entirely predictable. It was not bravado. It was the expression of a consistent principle that ran through everything he did. He would not ask anyone to face something he was unwilling to face himself. Mauno Koivisto, the future president of Finland, who served under his command, made this specific observation publicly at the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Ilomantsi in 1994, that Törni bore his share just like the others, and never demanded from his men what he would not demand of himself. Törni's relationship with personal danger was not recklessness. It was a considered and deliberate refusal to accept the separation between leadership and risk. By 1943, the war on the Finnish-Soviet front had found its character. The lines had largely stabilised following the Finnish advance of 1941, and the fighting had settled into attritional grinding punctuated by reconnaissance, raids and deep penetration operations in the forests and marshes of eastern Karelia. Finnish High Command recognised that Törni's particular combination of skills was being wasted in a conventional infantry role. His calm under pressure, his ability to read terrain, his instinct for small unit offensive action, his refusal to be deterred by odds or conditions. These were gifts that a standard line regiment could not fully exploit. In 1943 they gave him what he needed. They authorised him to form his own hand-picked unit. The unit was informally named Detachment Thorne, in Finnish, Osasto Törni. It wore its own insignia, the letter T crossed by a diagonal lightning bolt. The detachment began at 60 to 70 men. Every single one of them was selected personally. Törni did not recruit for enthusiasm. He selected for endurance, skiing ability, composure under direct fire, and the capacity to operate for extended periods deep behind Soviet lines with no external support and no reliable extraction route. He then equipped them in a way that set the unit apart from every other Finnish formation. They carried Soviet weapons, Soviet submachine guns, Soviet rifles, Soviet pistols, the standard arms of the Red Army's own soldiers. The reasoning was twofold. A patrol armed with Soviet weapons and moving in the correct formation could pass, in the dim light of a forest trail or through a position at speed, for a Soviet unit, long enough to gain the decisive first seconds of any encounter. And behind Soviet lines, Soviet ammunition was inexhaustible, Finnish ammunition was not. By standardizing on enemy weapons, Detachment Thorne made itself logistically self-sustaining in territory where Finnish supply did not reach. They lived off the enemy's stores, used the enemy's guns and disappeared back into the forest, before the enemy could organise a coherent response. The operations they ran were not pitched battles, they were raids, deep penetration missions into Soviet rear areas, strikes against headquarters and communication sites, ambushes of supply columns on roads that Soviet logistics were dependent on, destruction of bridges and stockpiles that fed the forward Soviet lines. The Soviets sent commando teams specifically to hunt them. Detachment Thorne hunted the hunters. Missions ran at distances that placed the unit multiple days from friendly lines, moving through forest and across frozen lake surfaces in conditions that would have halted any conventionally supplied formation. Thorne navigated in near-total darkness through forests so dense and uniform that a man could walk in circles for days without recognizing a landmark. His men came to believe he had an orientation that worked independently of light or compass. They were never lost. They hit what they came to hit, and came home. The Soviet Army's intelligence apparatus had been tracking the unit closely enough to understand that it was not a nuisance. It was causing damage disproportionate to its size at a level that required a dedicated command response. The response was a bounty, 3 million Finnish marks, and approximately $650,000 at the exchange rate of the time. The bounty was placed on Lauri Törni specifically, by name, for his capture, dead or alive. He was, as far as the available record indicates, the only Finnish military commander to be individually targeted by the Soviet army with a personal bounty during the entire conflict. No other Finnish officer, not a general, not a colonel, no one, was singled out this way. The figure is not a minor administrative measure. It reflects a calculation by Soviet military intelligence that this particular man, commanding this particular unit, was a problem requiring specific removal. Nobody ever tried to collect. The men who might have been positioned to make an attempt had a consistent way of not surviving their encounters with Detachment Thorne. In the summer of 1944, the strategic situation on the Finnish front collapsed with a speed that shocked even those who had expected it. On June 10, 1944, the Soviet Union launched the Vyborg-Petrozavodsk offensive, a massive, coordinated assault along the entire Finnish front, designed to force Finland's unconditional surrender and end the war in the north. The offensive was supported by artillery concentrations that dwarfed anything the Finns had faced in either the Winter War or the opening of the Continuation War. The preparatory bombardment on the Karelian Isthmus was described by Finnish commanders as a wall of fire. The VT line, Finland's first major defensive position, was overrun within days. Soviet armour punched through Finnish lines and began moving at a pace that threatened to unravel the entire defensive structure before reserves could be committed. Finland was fighting for its existence as a sovereign state. Detachment Thorne was thrown into the crisis as Soviet forces drove forward and Finnish units began to face encirclement in multiple sectors simultaneously. Thorne led his detachment into an operation to break one of those pockets. The specific geography of a Finnish encirclement in dense forest is worth understanding. It was not a clean perimeter with a defined inside and outside. It was a shifting, ragged zone of contested ground in terrain where visibility rarely exceeded 50 meters, where the unit inside the pocket was running low on ammunition, where resupply was impossible, and where the men had to maintain their cohesion and discipline while the relief force fought its way through a forest full of Soviet infantry. Thorne's relief operation broke the pocket. The trapped Finnish soldiers came out. Within days of this action, Thorne led a second operation, a covert penetration of Soviet lines specifically to capture Soviet intelligence material. The mission succeeded. Soviet documents were taken back to Finnish High Command, material that gave commanders specific information about Soviet intentions and dispositions in the sector, allowing them to position their reserves and prepare their responses with something approaching foreknowledge of the enemy's next move. Then came the Crossroads. It stands as one of the most remarkable small unit defensive actions of the entire Finnish-Soviet war, and it is barely known outside Finland. Detachment Thorne, reduced by this point to approximately 100 men, through casualties, detachments and the grinding attrition of the campaign, was ordered to hold a critical road junction. The order did not elaborate on what they would be holding it against. What arrived was 2 full Soviet infantry regiments, more than 4,000 men, with artillery support, 100 Finnish soldiers against 4,000 Soviet troops, at a choke point that, if overrun, would expose the Finnish withdrawal across an entire sector to catastrophic pressure and potentially trap the units pulling back through it. A conventional defensive calculation with those numbers was impossible. 4,000 against 100 meant annihilation if the Finns held a fixed line and took the assault head-on. Thorne did not hold a fixed line. He split the detachment into multiple independent groups, teams of 12, 15, 20 men, and set them in motion simultaneously at different points along the Soviet axis of advance. One group hit the Soviet column's lead elements from the tree line, then withdrew east. A second group, already positioned to the south, opened fire on the column's flank from a direction the Soviets had just cleared. A third hit the rear of the column as it was reacting to the flanking fire. Each group fired, moved, and disappeared into the forest before Soviet return fire could be concentrated. Then they reappeared somewhere else. The effect on Soviet command was deep disorientation. A force of 4,000 men, advancing on a junction they knew was held by Finnish soldiers, found themselves simultaneously engaged from multiple directions, with no ability to fix the size or position of the enemy force. The regimental commanders concluded they were facing a formation significantly larger than what was actually there. They slowed. They called for support that would take time to arrive. They failed to press the advance with the speed and weight that would have overwhelmed Törni's 100 men on contact. The Finnish units withdrew through the junction. The withdrawal held. During the action, Törni was hit by a landmine for the second time. He kept fighting. The Manorheim Cross was awarded to Lauri Törni on July 9, 1944. He was the 144th Knight of the Manorheim Cross, Finland's highest military decoration, reserved for acts of exceptional battlefield valour, equivalent in standing to the Medal of Honour or the Victoria Cross. The cross was awarded to 191 recipients across the entire period of the Second World War. It has never been awarded since. In 2006, 62 years after Törni received his, the Finnish military magazine Soldier of Finland put the question to its readers. Among all 191 knights, who was the most courageous? The readership voted for Lauri Törni, not Manorheim himself, who was also a recipient, not the generals who commanded army corps. Törni, the captain who fought in the forest with 60 men. The Battle of Ilomantsi, fought from 26 July to 13 August 1944, was the last major engagement of the Finnish-Soviet War, and it stands as one of the most complete Finnish tactical victories of the entire conflict. It was fought in North Karelia, in forested terrain 40 kilometers wide and 30 deep, near the Finnish-Soviet border. The Soviet forces committed were two divisions of Marshal Meretskov's Karelian Front, the 176th Rifle Division under Colonel Zolotarev, and the 289th Rifle Division under Major General Chernuka. Their combined initial strength was approximately 16,000 men, ground down by prior fighting to around 11,000 by the time the Finnish counterattack opened. During the battle, they were reinforced by the 3rd Naval Infantry Brigade and the 69th and 70th Naval Rifle Brigades, bringing total Soviet strength to over 20,000. The Finnish force numbered roughly 13,000 under Major General Erkki Raapana. Törni commanded the reconnaissance company within Raapana's force. In Finnish forest warfare, this was not a peripheral role. Reconnaissance was the intelligence mechanism on which everything depended, the means by which Finnish commanders located Soviet formations moving through terrain where an entire division could disappear into the trees and re-emerge kilometers away without being observed. Visibility in that forest measured in tens of meters. Roads were absent or minimal. Maps were approximations. Törni's company found them. They tracked the 176th and 289th Divisions through the forest, established their positions, identified the gaps and the axes of movement, and fed that intelligence back to Raapana's headquarters in time to be operationally useful. Among the soldiers in Törni's reconnaissance company was a young corporal named Mauno Koivisto, who would later serve as President of Finland from 1982 to 1994, and who described the battle publicly 50 years afterward. By August 1st, Finnish forces had cut the sole road serving the Soviet 176th Division. By August 3rd, both Soviet divisions were encircled, caught in motty positions, isolated pockets, sealed off from resupply and reinforcement, fighting in a forest with no usable roads, and no way to sustain their ammunition expenditure at the rate of a modern offensive. The Soviets threw 3 fresh brigades at the Finnish encirclement ring to open a corridor. The brigades sustained approximately 3,000 casualties in 9 days and failed to break through. The encircled Soviet divisions, starving and running critically short of artillery ammunition, eventually received permission to attempt a breakout through the forests, abandoning everything heavy as they fled. When it was over on August 13th, the 2 divisions had left behind more than 3,200 dead, thousands of wounded and missing, over 100 pieces of heavy artillery, approximately 100 mortars, and the bulk of their divisional equipment, trucks, radios, medical stores. The 2 Soviet formations that had arrived at Ilomantsi as coherent divisions departed as broken remnants. After Ilomantsi, Stavka, the Soviet Supreme Command, halted the entire offensive against Finland and dropped its demands for Finland's unconditional surrender. The battle is one of the reasons Finland remained an independent country. That is not hyperbole. It is what the historical record shows. The Moscow Armistice was signed on the 19th of September 1944. Its terms required Finland to demobilize the majority of its armed forces, cede the territory the Winter War had taken, and, critically, expel all German forces from Finnish territory by force if necessary. The Lapland War between Finland and Germany followed. Most of the Finnish army was demobilized, including Törni, who was out of uniform by November 1944. He was 25 years old. He had been at war, continuously or nearly so, for 5 years. He had commanded Finland's most effective deep penetration unit. He had broken encirclements, stolen intelligence, held Crossroads against impossible odds, and fought at the last battle that preserved Finnish independence. Now he was unemployed in a country that had signed a peace with the power he had spent 5 years fighting, and which was now legally required to treat any continued resistance to that power as a criminal act. In January 1945, Törni was recruited by a pro-German resistance movement operating within Finland. The movement's stated purpose was preparation for a potential Soviet occupation, the creation of a partisan infrastructure that would enable resistance to continue if the armistice failed and Soviet forces moved in. Whether this organization was genuinely defensive in character, or whether it had broader goals connected to German strategic interests in Finland, remains contested. The Finnish historians Pohjonen and Silvenoinen argued in 2013 that the training Törni received was connected to plans for a national socialist political coup in Finland. Finnish Minister of Defence Jussi Niinistö rejected this interpretation, arguing the evidence supported a straightforwardly patriotic motivation grounded in fear of Soviet occupation. Both arguments have documented basis. The full truth of what Törni understood his participation to mean is not recoverable. What is documented is what he did. He accepted. He and a fellow Finnish officer, Lieutenant J-Lo Korpela, were transported to Germany by German submarine, not through conventional channels but under the waves through the Baltic, arriving in a country that was by now clearly losing the war. The training program he joined in Germany was focused on the specific disciplines of sustained underground resistance, clandestine communications, explosives, the creation of cell-structured networks that could survive the destruction of individual components. The training was cut short in March 1945. The Third Reich was collapsing too fast for the program to continue. Allied forces were across the Rhine. Soviet forces were 60 kilometers from Berlin. The Baltic ports through which Törni might have returned to Finland were either in Soviet hands or under direct threat. There was no way home. Törni did what he had always done. He found a fight. Unable to return to Finland, he joined a Waffen-SS unit fighting Soviet forces near Schwerin in northern Germany, and was given command as a captain, Hauptsturmführer, in the Sonderkommando Nord. He could barely speak German. It did not impair his effectiveness. He applied in the forests near Schwerin the same methods he had applied in the forests of Karelia: controlled aggression, composure under fire, the refusal to be intimidated by disparity of numbers. The men he commanded, who had no particular reason to trust a Finnish officer they had just met, followed him. In late April and early May 1945, with German surrender imminent and Soviet forces pushing from the east, Törni made his way west and surrendered to British forces. He was sent to a POW camp at Lübeck. He was there briefly. He escaped, crossed back into Finland, and arrived in June 1945. What followed was the most legally absurd sequence in a life that contained more than one candidate for that title. Törni had returned to the country he had spent years defending. His family was in Helsinki. He went to find them. He was arrested almost immediately by Valpo, the Finnish state security police, acting in large part on Soviet pressure to deliver him. The charge was treason, specifically having served in the German military after Finland had concluded its armistice with the Soviet Union. Törni escaped from custody. He was rearrested in April 1946. He was tried between October and November of that year, convicted, and sentenced in January 1947 to 6 years in prison. He was 27 years old and was being imprisoned for continuing to fight the same enemy that had taken his hometown, occupied half the continent, and would have occupied Finland itself if not for the actions of men like him. He was sent to Turku Provincial Prison. In June 1947, he escaped through a church window during religious services. He was recaptured and transferred to Riihimäki State Prison, a considerably more secure facility. He remained there until December 1948, when President Juho Paasikivi granted him a full pardon. The decision reflected the genuine ambivalence within Finnish society about what Törni had actually done. He had fought for Finland through both wars with exceptional distinction. He had earned the country's highest military honour, The treason charge was technically accurate. He had served in a foreign army after the armistice, but to the hundreds of thousands of Finns who had fought alongside him, or whose families owed their survival partly to units like Detachment Thorne, the word treason sat badly on the tongue. Released in December 1948, Törni was free but had no prospects, and no military role in a Finland now legally obligated to maintain Soviet goodwill by suppressing exactly the kind of activity he had spent his adult life pursuing. The Soviets had not forgotten him. The formal bounty was expired, but the desire to have him in a Soviet courtroom, on whatever charges could be constructed, remained real, and Finland's government was under continued pressure regarding him. In 1949, Törni left. He crossed into Sweden with his wartime executive officer, Lieutenant Holger Pitkänen. At the border crossing from Tornio to Haparanda, in Stockholm, he was sheltered by Baroness von Essen, a Swedish aristocrat who had developed a pattern of harbouring fugitive Finnish officers after the war. Pitkänen was arrested and repatriated to Finland. Törni stayed. In Stockholm, Törni met a Swedish-Finnish woman named Maja Kops. He fell in love with her and they became engaged. The engagement would not survive what his life demanded of him, but it was genuine. Before the marriage could happen, he needed to establish himself economically. He signed on as a Swedish merchant seaman under a false identity and began working the shipping routes out of Gothenburg. In 1950, aboard the Swedish cargo vessel MS Skagen, on a voyage to the Americas, he made the decision that changed everything. As the ship passed through the Gulf of Mexico near Mobile, Alabama, Lauri Törni went over the side. He swam to shore. He presented himself to American immigration authorities as a political refugee from the Soviet sphere. He was 29 years old, had no valid documents in his real name, spoke limited English, and had entered the country by swimming off a foreign vessel in international waters. It was, by any standard measure, not a promising legal position. He made his way to New York City to Sunset Park in Brooklyn, where a significant community of emigrated Finns had settled. He worked as a carpenter. He cleaned floors. He spent 3 years in this state, a man who had commanded the most effective deep penetration unit in Finnish military history, now stripping wood floors in Brooklyn and doing construction work for Finnish-American building contractors. The adjustment was not small. What is notable is that he made it. He had, throughout his life, demonstrated a capacity to enter radically different environments and function effectively within them. This was the same capacity applied to peacetime. In 1953, under the Lodge-Filben Act, a Cold War instrument designed specifically to allow citizens of Soviet-adjacent countries to join the American military in exchange for a citizenship pathway. He was granted permanent residence. The act was tailored for exactly this kind of recruit, experienced anti-communist with combat skills that the United States Army could use. For Törni, it fit precisely. In January 1954, Lauri Törni enlisted in the United States Army as a private. He was 34 years old. He took the name Larry Thorne. Practical, anglicized, uncomplicated, and sufficiently removed from his actual history to simplify administrative processes that were not well designed to categorize a Finnish SS Finnish Swedish American who had escaped from 3 different custodial situations. In the army, he was immediately identified by a group of Finnish American officers already embedded in the Special Forces community. These men, known informally as Martinen's men after Colonel Alpo Martinen, had followed a parallel path under the Lodge-Filben Act and had helped build the US Army Special Forces from its early years. They knew who Törni was, they knew what he had done. They made certain the right people in the Special Forces hierarchy were informed of what they had just received. Thorne was assigned as an instructor at the Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The subjects he taught were the subjects he had practiced under fire in Karelia: skiing and cold weather movement, survival in extreme conditions, mountaineering, guerrilla tactics, the conduct of deep penetration raids, evasion and resistance to capture. He taught men who had read about these disciplines in field manuals what the manuals could not convey: the specific quality of silence that preceded an ambush, how to read a forest for signs of recent movement, how to sustain a small unit's cohesion and combat effectiveness when operating beyond any possibility of resupply or reinforcement for days on end. He attended airborne school and worked through the enlisted ranks. When he received US citizenship in 1957, he immediately attended officer candidate school and was commissioned as a first lieutenant in the Signal Corps. By 1960, he had received a regular Army commission and been promoted to captain. He was not a foreign hire given a comfortable administrative role. He was producing. From 1958 to 1962, Thorne served with the 10th Special Forces Group at Bad Tölz in West Germany. Geographically, the same region where the Waffen-SS had trained some of its officer candidates 15 years earlier, in 1962, a mission arose that demonstrated in specific terms why he was valued by the Special Forces community beyond his teaching. A United States Air Force reconnaissance aircraft had crashed high in the Zagros Mountains of Iran on a 14,000-foot ridge near the Soviet border. The aircraft was carrying classified equipment. 3 previous recovery attempts, by USAF teams and by West German Army personnel, had failed. The terrain was lethal. Extreme altitude, ice, near vertical approaches in conditions that killed exposed personnel within hours. Thorne led a Special Forces detachment to the crash site through those conditions, found the aircraft in its ice-covered wreckage, recovered both the classified material and the remains of the crew, and extracted the entire team without incident. The teams that had gone before him had turned back. He did not. In November 1963, Captain Larry Thorne was deployed to South Vietnam as Detachment Commander of Special Forces Detachment, a 734. The mission was the organization and support of civilian irregular defense group camps in the Tin Bien district of the Mekong Delta, dense, difficult terrain of jungle, rice paddy and swamp abutting the Cambodian border, which served as a principal Viet Cong infiltration corridor from Cambodia into South Vietnam. Thorne established a Special Forces A camp at Tin Bien in April 1964, in the area the Mekong soldiers called the Seven Mountains region. The camp disrupted Viet Cong movement through the area with sufficient consistency to become a priority Viet Cong target. During a major VC attack on the camp, Thorne was wounded twice. He received 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star with V device for valor in the engagement. The attack at Tin Bien was subsequently described by author Robin Moore in his 1965 book, The Green Berets. The character of Captain Sven Corney in Moore's first chapter was drawn directly from Thorne. The quiet competence, the absolute calm in contact, the ability to lead irregular fighters who had no particular reason to trust an American officer. These qualities were not fictional creation. They were what the men who served alongside Thorne consistently described. Thorne returned to Vietnam for a second tour in February 1965, first with the 5th Special Forces Group and then immediately transferred to Military Assistance Command Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. MACVSOG was a classified joint special operations element, running reconnaissance teams into Laos, Cambodia and North Vietnam, in support of the strategic campaign to interdict North Vietnamese supply and infiltration routes. Its name was Bureaucratic Camouflage. It conducted some of the most dangerous operations of the entire war. Thorne helped write the standard operating procedures for the unit's cross-border reconnaissance missions, the frameworks within which teams would infiltrate enemy territory, operate without external support, and extract with the intelligence their commanders needed. He was not merely a participant, he was instrumental in shaping how the unit operated. In September 1965, cross-border operations into Laos were formally authorized under the codename Operation Shining Brass. Restrictions limited penetration to 50 kilometers inside Laotian territory. The cover story prepared for use if a team was captured was that they were searching for a crashed USAFC-123 cargo aircraft near the border. Nobody involved expected the story to hold under interrogation. It existed to provide the American government a thin layer of deniability if an operation surfaced publicly. The first target was designated D1, a suspected North Vietnamese truck terminus on Laotian Route 165, approximately 15 miles inside Laos, 20 miles northwest of the Cam Duc Special Forces camp. In the weeks before the mission launched, Thorne flew as an observer on multiple reconnaissance flights over eastern Laos, studying the terrain into which the teams would be operating. By the time the operation was ready, he was the American officer most familiar with what was on the ground in that area. On October 18, 1965, Thorne was the operations officer for the first Shining Brass cross-border mission. The team to be inserted was Recon Team Iowa, Master Sergeant Charles Petrie as team leader, Sergeant First Class Willie Card, 1 South Vietnamese Army lieutenant, and 7 Nung fighters. The insertion aircraft were CH-34 King Bee helicopters from the 219th Squadron of the Republic of Vietnam Air Force, whose pilots were among the most experienced and courageous in the Vietnamese Air Force, men who flew old, mechanically stressed aircraft into impossible terrain under rules that gave them almost no margin for error. The airborne control element was a USAFO-1 Bird Dog forward air controller, call sign Bird Dog 55, piloted by Air Force Major Harley Piles, with Marine Captain Winfield Sisson as observer and air liaison officer. Weather had been atrocious for 3 consecutive days. Rain, heavy overcast, near zero visibility in the mountains. The mission had been scrubbed repeatedly. On October 18th, one of the King Bee pilots found a gap in the cloud cover, a narrow hole, through which a helicopter could descend to the landing zone if the timing was exact. The insertion window was narrow and the weather was closing. The officer who had been assigned to fly in the command helicopter, the aircraft that would remain airborne to receive the team's initial radio report and direct support if needed, was not available. Thorne had planned the mission. He knew the target area better than anyone in the operation. He volunteered to take the position himself. He put Recon Team Iowa's King Bee through the gap. The helicopter descended through the cloud layer, found the landing zone, a slash and burn clearing inside Laos, and set the team down. The 6 men were in. The command King Bee carrying Thorne orbited above the cloud layer with the bird dog, waiting for the ground team's radio confirmation. The call came in. The team was safe, the landing zone was clear, and the mission was proceeding. Thorne radioed that the command helicopter was returning to base. That was the last communication received from him. The King Bee carrying Thorne, flying in deteriorating weather over mountainous terrain at low altitude and failing light, entered the clouds and did not emerge. The bird dog orbited until its fuel state forced withdrawal. When the insertion King Bee climbed back through the overcast after dropping the team, there was nothing above the cloud layer. The command helicopter and its crew had simply disappeared. Search and rescue teams were launched immediately. The terrain and the persistent poor visibility in the mountains made systematic search impossible in the days that followed. The wreckage was eventually located before the end of the war. A search and recovery team was inserted to the site. The South Vietnamese crew were recovered, First Lieutenant Phan The Long, First Lieutenant Nguyen Bao Thung, and Sergeant Bui Van Lan. There was no trace of Larry Thorne. The US Army listed him as missing in action. In October 1966, he was reclassified as presumed killed in action. The Army's official record placed the crash in South Vietnam rather than Laos, because the operation was officially not occurring in Laos. MACVSOG's first combat casualty was thus recorded in the wrong country for reasons of government policy. He was posthumously promoted to Major in December 1965 and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Legion of Merit. Recon Team Iowa completed its mission. The intelligence they gathered resulted in 88 bombing sorties against the D1 truck terminus, producing multiple secondary explosions. By the only measure that mattered operationally, the mission succeeded. Among the men of MACVSOG and the broader Special Forces community, what followed was a peculiar collective suspension of certainty. Thorne's body had not been recovered. In a unit where remains were frequently not findable, this was not conclusive. More significantly, the men who had served with Thorne found it genuinely difficult to accept that a helicopter crash could have killed a man who had survived everything else. He had stepped on 2 landmines and kept fighting. He had escaped from British, Finnish, and prison custody in 3 separate incidents. He had survived 5 years of the hardest combat on the Eastern Front of the Second World War and emerged without being captured. Every year his Special Forces colleagues gathered and toasted his health, not his memory, his health. They believed, in the way that soldiers believe things about exceptional men, that Larry Thorne was out there somewhere, alive, on his own terms. In 1999, a joint US-Finnish excavation team from Joint Task Force Full Accounting recovered remains from the CH-34 crash site in the mountains of Puok Son district. They found bone fragments, equipment, and a Swedish-made machine pistol, not a standard US Army weapon carried by personal preference, consistent with the man who had always armed himself with whatever worked best, rather than whatever regulations required. DNA confirmed the identities of the South Vietnamese crew. Thorne's identification came not from DNA, but from dental records. He had a dental crown on tooth number 18. It matched. Formally identified on December 6, 2002, Lauri Törni, Larry Alan Thorne, was buried at Arlington National Cemetery on June 26, 2003, in Section 60, alongside the 3 South Vietnamese crewmen who had died with him on the hillside in Laos. His fiancée, Maja Kops, whom he had met in Stockholm and never married because the momentum of his life had not permitted it, survived him. She was his only next of kin. The ceremony at Arlington was preceded by a repatriation ceremony at Hanoi's Noi Bai International Airport, attended by US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Ambassador Pete Peterson. At the crash site itself in 1999, when the remains were recovered, a small ceremony was held. A Vietnamese colonel who had fought for the Viet Cong in that area during the war attended and paid his respects. Törni's nephew, Juha Rajala, left a plate at the site, bearing the letter T crossed by a diagonal lightning bolt, the symbol of Detachment Thorne, carried 55 years across 3 oceans, and placed at last in the Laotian mountains, where the man had stopped. In 2010, Törni was named the first honorary member of the United States Army Special Forces Regiment, the only person ever to receive that designation. In 2011, he was inducted into the U.S. Special Operations Command Commando Hall of Honor. The 10th Special Forces Group Headquarters building at Fort Carson, Colorado, bears his name. The 10th Group presents the Larry Thorne Award annually to its best operational detachment alpha, Special Forces Association. Chapter 33 in Cleveland, Tennessee, is named after him. The Infantry Museum at Mikkeli, Finland, maintains a permanent exhibit. The Military Museum in Helsinki maintains another. He is the patron figure of both the Finnish Parachute Rangers and the Coastal Rangers, Finland's premier special operations formations. Lauri Törni was not a simple figure, and the temptation to make him one, either a pure patriot or a pure villain, consistently fails against the evidence. He served in the Waffen-SS, that is a fact. The Finnish volunteer battalion trained with him and fought under SS command in formations whose conduct during the march through Ukraine and the Caucasus included documented atrocities. Finnish State Archives research has confirmed this, and it is part of the record that cannot be detached from any honest account of that battalion. The direct evidence of Törni's own involvement in atrocities does not exist, and attributing institutional guilt to an individual on the basis of membership alone is an exercise in something other than history. But the context is real, and anyone engaging seriously with this man's biography cannot pretend that the SS designation is merely administrative. What the record shows, consistently, from every person who served alongside him, is a man driven by a specific and unvarying motivation. The Soviet Union was an existential threat to Finland, and he would fight it under whatever flag gave him the authority to do so. He fought for Finland because Finland was fighting the Soviets. He trained with the Waffen-SS because Germany was fighting the Soviets and the training was available and useful. He joined the German unit at Schwerin in 1945 because there was no other available way to continue fighting the Soviets when he was stranded in Germany. He enlisted in the United States Army because the United States was fighting communism globally, and the Lodge-Philbin Act provided the mechanism. The thread is singular, the flags are 3, the war is 1. Mauno Koivisto, who served under him and would go on to lead Finland as its president, described him in terms that had nothing to do with ideology. The man bore his share like the others. He did not ask his men to go where he would not go himself. The numbers of his military life placed in sequence: 2 landmines in Finland, survived both, 4 wounds total across 3 wars, 3 escapes from custody, 1 Manorheim Cross, 1 detachment that the Soviet army put a price on, 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star in Vietnam, 1 Zagros Mountains. Recovery mission that 3 previous teams had abandoned, 1 MACVSOG Standard Operating Procedure Framework, written before the unit's first operational mission, 1 cross-border insertion into Laos on October 18, 1965, completed successfully, 1 command helicopter that did not come back through the clouds. The machine pistol was found near the wreckage. It was not a weapon the US Army had issued to him. It was not a regulation. It was his own, carried by personal choice, the way he had always equipped himself, with what worked rather than what was specified. The weapon identified the crash site. The dental crown confirmed the man, 46 years old, still carrying his own gun. The white headstone in Section 60 of Arlington reads Larry Allen Thorne. Beneath it is Lauri Törni. They are the same person. 1 man, 1 war, 3 flags, and a life that refused every boundary placed around it. Political, geographic, legal, or physical. He found his way to every front where his particular enemy was present, under whatever authority would give him the right to be there, with whatever weapons were to hand. The bounty the Soviets placed on him never paid out. The prison sentences never held. The peace treaties that tried to make his fighting irrelevant never stopped him. He died in the clouds above a country the United States was not officially operating in, on the first mission of the most classified program of the Vietnam War, having already ensured the team he was responsible for was safely on the ground. That was the last thing he did.